The hotel receipt fell out of my wife's coat pocket on a Wednesday night. It was one of those moments that seem small until your body reacts before your mind does. A folded slip of paper, light enough to drift to the kitchen floor while I was hanging up her coat, ordinary enough that I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name of the place. The Ashford Inn. I knew that hotel. Not because we had ever stayed there, and not because it was romantic. It sat across town just off the interstate, attached to a half-dead shopping plaza and a parking lot that always looked slightly wet, even in dry weather. It was the kind of hotel people used for business trips, temporary stays, or things they didn't want happening at home. The receipt was from 2 nights earlier. One guest. Room 214. Paid in cash. I stood in the kitchen staring at it long enough for the refrigerator motor to kick on behind me. My wife, Elena, was upstairs putting our son to bed. I could hear the low rhythm of her voice through the vent, soft, patient, ordinary. That made the paper in my hand feel even worse. Affairs are one thing in theory. In practice, they arrive in the middle of ordinary domestic sounds. Bedtime stories. Dishwasher hum. A basket of unfolded laundry on the chair. I slipped the receipt into my pocket before she came downstairs. I didn't say anything that night. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But there's a difference between suspicion and proof, and once you accuse someone you can't uncross that line. So I lay next to her in bed while she slept, staring at the ceiling and replaying every strange thing from the last 2 months. The late errands. The unexplained cash withdrawals. The way she had started showering as soon as she got home. Her phone on silent all the time. A new carefulness around me that I had first mistaken for distance, then guilt. By morning I had already built the worst version of the story. Another man. It's almost embarrassing how quickly the mind fills gaps with humiliation. Elena and I had been married 11 years. We weren't newlyweds, but we weren't broken either. We had a 9-year-old son, a mortgage, a kitchen faucet that whistled if you turned it too far left, and the kind of life people call stable because nothing dramatic appears to be on fire from the outside. That's why the hotel receipt felt so obscene. It suggested an entire hidden version of my wife's life moving just out of sight of mine. The next few days I watched her in a way that made me hate myself. I noticed when she smiled at her phone and when she didn't. I noticed when she left the room to answer a call. I noticed how twice she said she was going to the grocery store and came back with almost nothing. On Friday, I checked our bank account. No hotel charge. But 3 cash withdrawals over the past month, all for small amounts. 200. 150. 200 again. Enough to pay in cash. Not enough to trigger questions if you weren't already looking. That evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, I said as casually as I could, "You ever go near the Ashford Inn?" If she was startled, she hit it well. "No," she said, rinsing plates. "Why?" "No reason. Just drove past it." She nodded once and kept washing dishes. That should have comforted me if I had been sane. Instead, it confirmed she could lie without blinking. By the next week, I was doing things I once would have judged in other people. Checking mileage. Looking through her purse when she showered. Watching for patterns in what days she wore makeup to run errands. Betrayal turns decent people into investigators because uncertainty is harder to live with than shame. Then Tuesday came. Elena told me she was going to see her aunt after work because she hasn't been feeling great. She kissed our son on the head, grabbed her bag, and left. Her aunt had died 3 years earlier. That was the moment suspicion stopped being a theory. I didn't call her out. I followed her. She drove across town during rush hour, then took the exit toward the interstate and pulled into the parking lot of the Ashford Inn. I parked across the street near a closed pharmacy and watched her go inside. I wish I could tell you I felt rage first. What I felt was collapse. Because until then some part of me had still been bargaining with reality. Maybe the receipt had belonged to someone else. Maybe she'd picked it up by mistake. Maybe there was some explanation, ugly but survivable. Watching my wife walk into that hotel erased all of them. She was inside for 23 minutes. Yes, I counted. Then she came back out carrying a paper bag from the diner next door. She looked around before getting into her car, not dramatically, but enough to tell me secrecy had become habit. I waited until she drove away, then crossed the street and went in. The man at the desk was about 60, wearing reading glasses low on his nose and watching a baseball game on a tiny mounted TV. I had no plan beyond momentum. My wife was just here, I said, and even now I'm amazed at how steady my voice sounded. I think she left something in the room. He frowned. Name? I gave Elena's first name. He checked the screen. Then shook his head. She's not checked in. I stood there, thrown just enough off balance that I nearly stopped. I saw her come out, I said. The man looked irritated more than suspicious. She was visiting someone. My mouth went dry. Who? He gave me a look that clearly said this was none of my business. And somehow that expression, that bored, gatekeeping little look, pushed me over the edge. I'm her husband. That changed nothing. Of course it changed nothing. He started to turn away, and I did the stupidest thing I've ever done in public. I reached across the desk just far enough to see the open registry sheet beside the keyboard. Room 214. Occupant name. Mara Vallon. I didn't know anyone named Mara Vallon. Which only made it worse. The clerk snapped the paper back and told me to leave. I did, because there was no next move that didn't end with police or humiliation or both. That night I waited until our son was asleep and put the hotel receipt on the kitchen table between us. Elena looked at it. Then at me. Then sat down without a word. That silence was more frightening than denial. Who is Mara Vallon? I asked. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered, "You followed me." I laughed once, sharp, joyless. That's your problem with this? Her eyes filled with tears immediately, which at that moment only made me angrier. Tears during confrontation can mean remorse, but they can also mean someone is grieving the end of control. Elena, I said, who is in that hotel room? She covered her mouth with one hand and started crying harder. I had expected lies. Excuses. Maybe even a confession. What I had not expected was fear. Real fear. Not fear of being caught. Fear of saying the thing out loud. Finally she looked at me and said, "My sister." That meant nothing for half a second. Then everything in my body went cold. Elena's older sister, Sophia, had been dead for 16 years. Overdose. 22 years old. Family tragedy I had heard in careful, edited versions since the beginning of our relationship. There were only a few photos of her in Elena's father's house, all turned slightly inward like the family itself never knew where to look when her name entered the room. "No," I said quietly. "Your sister is dead." Elena shook her head. "No," she whispered. "That's what my father told everyone." The truth came out in pieces, ugly and shaking. Sophia hadn't died. She had disappeared after stealing money from their father and leaving with a man twice her age. The family called hospitals, police, relatives. Then her father found out she had been using again and, ashamed and furious, told people she had overdosed out of state. He made the death into fact because it was easier than admitting abandonment, addiction, and public humiliation. Elena was 15. She believed the overdose story for years. 3 months ago, she got a message on Facebook from a woman named Mara Vallon. It was Sophia. Not dead. Just older, sober for 6 months, broke, and dying now in a far less dramatic way than the family lie had imagined. Kidney failure, unstable housing, nowhere to go. The hotel room wasn't for Elena. It was for her sister. Paid in cash so there would be no record tying back to the family. Food brought quietly. Medicine when she could afford it. Visits squeezed between errands and lies. I sat there feeling every emotion at once and trusting none of them. Why didn't you tell me? Elena's answer came fast, as if she had rehearsed it in her own head 100 times. Because I didn't know if she was telling the truth. Because I didn't know if she'd ask for money. Because I knew if my father found out, he'd try to drag me into choosing between them. Because once I said it out loud, it would become real. That, at least, I understood. But understanding is not the same as forgiveness. You let me think you were cheating. She looked up, confused and hurt. I didn't know you thought that. You had hotel receipts in your pocket, Elena. I know. You lied about seeing your dead aunt. I know. You walked into a motel with cash. At that, she broke. Not theatrically. Not defensively. She just folded forward at the table and cried the way exhausted people cry when they can't hold up the structure anymore. My sister is dying in a hotel room, she said. I didn't know how to fit that into dinner and homework and normal life. That line hit me harder than anything else. Because there it was. The ugly truth beneath all the lies. Not an affair. Not another man. A family secret rotting back to life at the edge of our marriage. The next day I asked to meet her. Sophia, or Mara, because that was the name she'd been using, looked nothing like the ghost I had built in my mind. She looked tired. Thin. Not dangerous, not dramatic. Just worn down by years that had not been kind to her. She apologized to me before I even sat down. Then apologized for apologizing. People like to imagine revelations make everything simple. They don't. Finding out your wife is helping her long-lost sister die quietly in a motel room is not the kind of truth that restores trust neatly. It just replaces one pain with another. Yes, I was relieved there wasn't another man. Yes, I hated myself a little for what I had assumed. But I was still angry. Still hurt. Still living inside weeks of lies that had turned me into someone I didn't like. Sophia died 11 days later. Elena told her father after the funeral home had already taken the body. He hung up on her. Then called back crying. Then called again the next day pretending he hadn't. That was 2 months ago. My wife and I are still together. I think we will stay that way. But not because the truth made everything okay. It didn't. It just made the damage sadder. Sometimes I still think about that receipt hitting the kitchen floor. How quickly I turned it into betrayal. How sure I was that I understood what a hotel meant. Maybe most of us do that. We take the shape of secrecy and fill it with the worst thing we know how to imagine. Sometimes we're right. And sometimes the truth is stranger than cheating, and heavier too. Because an affair might have ended my marriage cleanly. What I got instead was a dying woman in room 214, a wife carrying grief and shame in secret, and the uncomfortable realization that the person you love can be hiding something devastating without ever intending to betray you at all.